经中所两国政府批准。
Approved by the governments of China and Solomon Islands, State Councilor and Foreign Minister Wang Yi and Solomon Islands Foreign Minister Jeremiah Manel, on behalf of the two governments, formally signed a framework agreement on security cooperation between the governments of China and Solomon Islands recently. The security agreement, signed between Beijing and the small South Pacific nation of Solomon Islands, is now weighing heavily on the minds of several of the world's major powers. The agreement, which had previously been kept secret, was leaked on March 24th, suggesting that China could deploy troops to the Solomon Islands and possibly establish a naval base there.
We understand that the Solomon Islands and the PRC are discussing a broad security-related agreement building on recently signed police cooperation. Despite the Solomon Islands government's comments, the broad nature of the security agreement leaves open the door for the deployment of PRC military forces to the Solomon Islands. We believe that signing such an agreement could increase destabilization within the Solomon Islands and will set a concerning precedent for the wider Pacific Island region.
The South Pacific is an important route between the United States, Australia, and New Zealand. The Solomon Islands is an island nation in the region, and its location is of great strategic importance. The country's main island, Guadalcanal, is Australia's northern gateway, and by blocking it, Australian warships cannot freely access the Pacific Ocean from the north. Moreover, Guadalcanal and the world's deepest coral sea to its southwest are known as diving paradise. The Battle of the Coral Sea in May 1942 was the world's first battle of aircraft carriers against each other. The United States took the lead in this battle with Japan to win the Battle of Midway. Allied forces fought the Battle of Guadalcanal with Japan from August 1942 to February 1943 to protect the shipping routes between the United States, Australia, and New Zealand. For decades, the Solomon Islands had been considered the backyard of U.S. allies Australia and New Zealand. Therefore, Australia is the most worried. The U.S. and other Western allies have also expressed concern about this area turning into another potential conflict zone. In late April, White House Indo-Pacific Coordinator Kurt Campbell and the State Department's top official for Asia visited three Pacific Island nations, Solomon Islands, Fiji, and Papua New Guinea. The delegation stopped in Hawaii for consultations with senior U.S. Indo-Pacific Command military officials and regional partners. On April 13th, Australia's Minister for International Development and Pacific Affairs had to suspend his election campaign in the Capital Territory to visit the Solomon Islands. Prior to this, two senior Australian intelligence executives quietly traveled to the Solomon Islands to meet with the Solomons' Prime Minister to raise the Australian government's deep concerns about Solomon's security agreement with China. Why are Australia and the United States so concerned about the situation in the Solomon Islands? What is the content of the draft agreement between China and the Solomon Islands? On the evening of March 24th, a secretly drafted security treatment between the Chinese Communist Party, or CCP, and the Solomon Islands was posted online. The Solomon Islands Prime Minister didn't confirm whether the leaked draft was the final version, but the draft is comprehensive. The terms of the agreement include the ability for China to send naval vessels for stopovers and transitions on the islands. It also allows Beijing to deploy troops to protect the Chinese people and projects on the islands. And the Solomon Islands can request that China send police, armed police, military personnel, and other law enforcement and armed forces. Because the agreement doesn't clearly define the scope of the deployment or the powers these forces will have, Beijing has the opportunity to deploy any type of personnel. Even a relatively small Chinese force could help Beijing establish its first foothold in the South Pacific. This foothold would drain Australia's defense resources and put Australia at risk of having its supply lines cut off in the event of a military conflict.
中国和所罗门群岛安全合作的出发点是为了维护人民的
The point of the security cooperation between China and the Solomon Islands is to maintain the safety of people's lives and property. It is without any military element or overtones. The relevant remarks and speculations in the media are baseless and carry ulterior motives. Australian Defence Minister Peter Dutton said in an interview with Sky News that the CCP has built 20 military bases in the South China Sea, despite telling the US it won't militarize the region. That is, Beijing has built artificial islands in the disputed waters of the region and installed military equipment to prevent other countries' naval and air forces from entering. This allows Beijing to increase its intelligence gathering and detection capabilities. U.S. defense experts believe that Beijing is attempting to take control of the Solomon Islands' communications and satellite systems and to use local ports and airports for military purposes. It poses a serious threat to the freedom and openness of the Indo-Pacific region if the CCP succeeds. Sky News Australia reported on April 6th that it obtained a letter indicating that Beijing was planning to establish a communist military base in the Solomon Islands as early as 2020. A photo of a letter of intent from AVIC International Project Engineering Company, a Chinese state-owned company, to the former governor of Solomon's Isabel Province. The photo shows the document signed by Qian Rong, the Chinese company's general manager, dated September 29, 2020, and addressed to Leslie Kikolo, the former governor of Isabel Province. Qian Rong clearly stated that AVIC International was interested in leasing a piece of land in Isabel Province for 75 years to promote the development of a communist naval infrastructure project. That land is 2,000 kilometers from the coast of Queensland, Australia. Australia also has a security agreement with the Solomon Islands, but Beijing's security agreement has more far-reaching implications than Australia's. Australia's agreement, which is largely peacekeeping related, allows for the rapid deployment of troops to the Solomon Islands, which has a long history of violent unrest upon request and was reactivated in 2021 when deadly riots broke out in the capital of Honiara, prompting Australia, New Zealand, Fiji, and Vanuatu to send troops. The significance of the Solomon Islands' Beijing security agreements goes beyond the terms they contain. They suggest a level of closeness, cooperation, and trust between the nations. The presence of Chinese troops in the Pacific would completely disrupt the benign environment that nations have enjoyed for decades. Currently maintained by Australia, New Zealand, and the Pacific Islands Forum countries.
So our government is the government that stepped up in the Pacific. When we've stepped up in the face of increasing threats and increasing pressures, and we've been responding to those, and we will respond as a family of Pacific nations, of which Australia is one, New Zealand is another, and we'll be progressing those issues. And we respect the sovereignty of our individual island states in our region. They make their own decisions in their own places, and we respect their democracies. And at the same time, though, we will work with our partner states in the Pacific to ensure there is a keen understanding of the risks and threats that we believe this poses, and we've made those positions very clear.
The geographical importance of the South Pacific Islands has prompted Beijing to do its best to ostracize Taiwan. The Solomon Islands was one of the few countries that had diplomatic ties with Taiwan rather than with the CCP. Through the Belt and Road Project, the CCP has been pouring money into the country with $500 million US. After the new Prime Minister came to power in April 2019, the cabinet broke off diplomatic relations with Taiwan in September 2019. The Solomon Islands broke off its 36-year-long relationship with Taiwan and shifted to befriend Beijing. The Sogovari government believes this decision will lead to more economic aid and investment in infrastructure projects from the CCP. Taiwan's foreign ministry has accused Beijing of bribing Solomon Islands politicians to abandon Taipei. A month earlier, in August 2019, the United States had sent defense officials and aid contractors to the Solomon Islands so they could build and maintain local infrastructure, such as roads, without outside help. The U.S. project was delayed when the Pacific Island nation broke off diplomatic relations with Taiwan and established diplomatic relations with the CCP. In November 2021, residents of Malaita, the largest island in the Solomon Islands, entered the capital, Honiara, to protest authorities' decision to cut diplomatic ties with Taiwan and establish diplomatic relations with Beijing. Protesters clashed with police and demanded that the Prime Minister step down. The protest lasted for 3 days and many Chinese stores were vandalized. Despite the broken diplomatic relations with Taiwan, Malaita Province continued to maintain ties with Taiwan and banned Chinese companies from operating there. It was also during that riot that more than 200 police and soldiers from Australia, New Zealand, Papua New Guinea, and Fiji were in Honiara to maintain order at the request of Sogovari, a Pacific Islands researcher at the Lowy Institute for International Policy in Australia. said that since the policy shift in the Solomon Islands, Chinese companies have been increasingly active in the country's economy. But these Chinese projects are often awarded without transparency and employ mostly Chinese workers, sometimes with poor delivery quality. Beijing authorities have recently tried to alleviate local discontent with financial support. A Solomon Islands announcement on April 11th said China would provide agricultural machinery grants of about $100,000 to major commercial farms on Guadalcanal in Malaita. Meanwhile, the Solomon Islands Prime Minister has firmly defended his own cabinet's decision.
The security treaty, Mr. Speaker, is pursued at the request of Solomon Islands government. We are not pressured. We are not pressured in any way by our new friends. And there is no intention whatsoever, Mr. Speaker, to ask China to build a military base in Solomon Islands. Goodness. We're insulted. We're insulted by such unfounded stories.
For Beijing, it was a major diplomatic victory when the Solomon Islands dropped Taiwan. In fact, it was a trigger for a few subsequent events. On March 28, 2022, the U.S. Senate passed the America Competes Act. It includes a number of Taiwan-friendly provisions and identifies Taiwan as an important part of the U.S. Indo-Pacific strategy. The provisions include, for example, strengthening the U.S. commitment to Taiwan under the Taiwan Relations Act, supporting regular arms sales to Taiwan, promoting Taiwan's meaningful participation in international organizations such as the United Nations, and actively engaging in trade dialogues with Taiwan to seek a free trade agreement. Perhaps the biggest irritant to Beijing is this. The bill requires the State Department and other government agencies to stop referring to Taiwan's elected government by the outdated term Taiwan authorities, and also prohibits the U.S. government from limiting the ability of U.S. and Taiwan officials to communicate directly and regularly. The bill requires the Secretary of State to repeal, within 90 days of the effective date of the bill, any restriction on the display of symbols of sovereignty, including the flag or military emblem of the Republic of China, by members of Taiwan's military or representative offices in the United States in the performance of their official duties. Taiwan, officially known as the Republic of China or ROC, was founded in 1912 and withdrew from mainland China in 1949 to Taiwan. Both the People's Republic of China (PRC) and the Republic of China (ROC) are China in the broad sense. The CCP has long treated Taiwan as a province rather than as an independent government, and it's Beijing's red line in diplomacy. The new U.S. bill to stop referring to Taiwan as Taiwan authorities represents a major step toward recognizing the Taiwan government. The CCP's biggest concern is the legitimacy of its authoritarian government in the international arena. It is likely that Chinese intelligence agencies were informed of the new version of the America Competes Act in advance, and as a countermeasure, accelerated the launch of a security cooperation agreement with the Solomon Islands. Beijing's various actions in the South Pacific Islands suggest that the CCP is trying to manipulate the South Pacific. Engaging with Beijing, however, is a dangerous business. The Australian government is now very wary of CCP infiltration into Australia. The Canberra authorities have recently proposed a new Darwin port for national security reasons so that the Australian military and the U.S. troops can avoid using the facilities of the Darwin port, which is currently leased by the CCP. On March 31, 2022, the Australian Finance Minister confirmed that it will spend 1.5 billion Australian dollars, or about 1.1 billion US dollars, to build a new second port in Darwin. He said that in addition to providing industrial and commercial use, the new facility could also provide defensive use. The Port of Darwin is the closest deepwater port to Asia in northern Australia and is also an important military base. The city has been the site of the U.S. Marine Rotation Force in Darwin, MRFD, since 2012, and is frequently visited by U.S. warships crossing the Pacific and Indian Oceans and the 7th Fleet based in Japan. The Landbridge Group Australia, a subsidiary of Landbridge Group in China, has had a 99-year lease on the Port of Darwin since 2015. The group has since been exposed as having close ties to the CCP military, making the Darwin lease the focus of a national security controversy in Australia. Despite continued calls to revoke the lease, the Australian government has so far been unable to revoke it. On the other hand, the CCP is having an internal crisis. Its naval strength is far from sufficient to challenge Australia and its allies. Thus, the security agreement between the Solomon Islands and the CCP has accelerated the global trend of democratic forces uniting to isolate, clamp down on, and eliminate the CCP. And the signs of this global trend are already evident. Against this backdrop, Taiwan is in reality much more secure in the event of a forceful invasion by the Chinese Communist Party.